Two Americans were captured by embattled Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro while they led an operation with the backing of dozens of Venezuelans to try and overthrow him. However, that raid failed. The Maduro regime claimed it was a U.S.-led operation, but both President Trump and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo have put those accusations to rest. Here to discuss the situation more is Daniel Di Martino, an expatriate from Venezuela. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Stephanie.
So the U.S. has a strict policy in that we do not offer ransom in exchange for hostages. And as we know, both President Trump and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said this was not a U.S.-led operation. What can we expect will happen next with those two Americans?
Well, I think that the State Department right now is trying to investigate whether in the first place these two Americans are actually collaborators of Maduro. The whole operation that happened last week was really strange in the circumstances. They had their IDs on. These people didn't even speak Spanish and were leading a team of Venezuelans who only speak Spanish. And the operation was infiltrated from the beginning by Cuban spies and by a man who is now in their U.S. custody called Cleaver Alcala for narco-terrorism charges that the United States brought up in March. So the whole operation was very strange, and there is really no reason to believe that these two men couldn't have been collaborating with Maduro. So there might not be a need for a ransom because they might be criminals themselves.
And it's interesting you point that out because one of them is being investigated for arms trafficking, and one of them even posted something on Twitter saying, oh, this operation essentially is going to happen. They didn't say those words exactly, but they alluded to it, and it's why would you put that out there if you're trying to get this ransom? We already know tensions between the U.S. and the Maduro regime are high, as Washington has repeatedly sanctioned Maduro and Cuban officials with ties to the Maduro regime. How will this further strain relations between the two nations?
Well, I think that the United States has a strategy and a goal. And I don't think that the strategy is really consistent with their goal. The goal of the United States and most other free nations is to push Maduro out. And the reason is simple. Millions of people like myself have had to flee your country, and hundreds of thousands have died over the last couple decades because of the policies of the Maduro regime and because they hold power undemocratically in our hemisphere and because they sponsor terrorism abroad. So we have to get Maduro out, but not just him, the whole regime. The problem is that the strategy of the United States until now has just been sanctions. And unfortunately, as we've seen in the case of Cuba, 60 years after sanctions, they have not worked. Obviously, the answer is not this kind of operation that is failed and not well organized. But the United States should be pursuing operations to try to capture the people who are indicted, such as Cleaver Alcala, who's already been captured, so that can send a message to the Maduro regime that they are not going to be held free, right? They're going to be held accountable for their actions. And if you capture a few of these men, like this operation was supposedly intended to do, that will really send them a message to tell them, you can go live in Cuba, but leave us the country of Venezuela for their freedom.
In the U.S. and other nations, we've seen, or rather we are recognizing Juan Guaido as the legitimate leader of Venezuela. How has he responded to this?
He has actually denied that he saw any contract. Jordan Goudreau, the American who is the mastermind, supposed mastermind behind this operation, who's not in Venezuela, by the way, we believe he's still in Colombia. He says that Guaido agreed to this. Guaido denies it. And the main advisor of Guaido, who was in this contract that he actually did sign, and he admitted to even paying $50,000 out of his pocket for Goudreau's expenses, he says that Guaido was not there, but he was acting in representation of Guaido. So I think that there's a lot of inconsistencies within the story of the Guaido government, and they really need to get this straightened out because Venezuelans like myself, like everybody else who've been fighting for freedom for many years, deserve an answer of why would the interim government enter into a contract with an unknown firm made up of 3 Americans who had no experience whatsoever except having been for a few years in combat. And also being tied with a narco-terrorist like Cleaver Alcala. It just makes no sense to have signed any contract in the first place.
Want to see more videos like this? Click on the link below and subscribe to One America News on YouTube, and call your cable provider and kindly demand that One America News is added to your lineup. Call and subscribe today.